Alrighty, folks, welcome back. Let's just get this going. All right, welcome to Introduction to Psychology, Language. All right, so we are going to be talking, this is essentially our chapter on cognitive psychology. So we essentially have one chapter to cover all of developmental psychology and one chapter to cover all of behavioral neuroscience and neurobiology and all kinds of neurology. So obviously it's impossible to do. We've got one chapter to cover all of cognitive psychology. And so cognitive psychology is essentially the nuts and bolts of how we process information as an information processing entity, machine of sorts. And its job is to take in information and process that information, meaning take in information and do stuff with it, make it useful to us in some way or another, transform it, store it, or in computer terminology, computer science terminology, input output, right? Our brain, we're getting information in and we're outputting information. We're listening and then we're speaking. We're seeing and then we're reacting, right? Our brain is constantly putting different things based on the inputs coming into it. And that's what cognitive psychology is, how we do all that stuff. And language is typically a part of the things that are studied in cognitive psychology, but also, what are concepts? How do we store information? How do we process, how do we identify shapes? How do we identify faces? How do we, all the different things our brains have to do, cognitive psychologists have to try and figure out how they do that. All right. So let's jump ahead. Lots of objectives. We'll just jump right in. Attention and categorization. So cognition is thinking and using knowledge. The typical way cognitive psychologists infer cognitive processes is by measuring the speed and accuracy of responses. Choice blindness is the tendency of people to act as if they don't know what choice they have made. People make decisions without having an explanation, so they have to come up with one after the fact, right? So a famous study in early kind of judgment and decision making is a kind of sub area of cognitive psychology, and it's gotten a lot of attention because how we make choices and decide things is a pretty big deal. So one kind of classic early study is they showed people some different brands. I think the early study was done with pantyhose. They asked the women in the study to pick their favorite one. Now, unbeknownst to the women, they varied the order. So say there were 4 brands, A, B, C, and D. The first person might see them in the order of A, B, C, D. The second person might be like D, C, B, A, etc. So variations. And what they found was, so people would make different choices depending on the order that they were in. And they found that people typically tended to choose whatever the last one was. But what was interesting is they didn't say, well, I'm just going to choose this one because it's the last one. They would always make up some reason. So they didn't realize they were being influenced by the fact that that was the last one. They would be like, oh, it looks soft, or oh, I like the packaging, or I liked this fact about it or that fact. Conscious mind is not really in control of this whole thing we got going on here, even though it feels like it is. And there's been studies that show that, our brain, before we are able to articulate what our decision is going to be or our choice is going to be in a certain regard, our subconscious mind has often made that choice for us, right? This is kind of the last us up here in this prefrontal cortex. It's kind of like the last thing to know what's going on. It's the slowest, for one thing. It processes information much more slowly than other parts. It's not intuitive. It's not rapid. And we'll get into some of that stuff later. Okay, attention. Attention is the tendency to respond and remember to some stimuli more than others. Bottom-up and top-down processes or processing, these come out of the sensation perception topic as well. Bottom-up means attention controlled by peripheral stimuli. So sort of when our attention is being driven by things happening around us and we are sort of looking out at them. Top-down processes is when our brain says, look for mushrooms or whatever it might be, and now we start to do the thing, right? Okay. Sensation is a bottom-up process. Perception is a top-down process. Pre-attentive process, how we identify an object that sticks out immediately. attentive process, a strategy that requires searching through the items in a series, right? So pre-attentive processes are all the things that sort of the little tips and tricks our brain automatically does, right? Our brain is kind of drawn to this because of the fact that it's a bird in a sea of gray birds and a brown background. Whereas here, they're all very similar. So if you want to find the baby or whatever it might be, you have to, or I don't know, I guess we're supposed to be looking at that thing, whatever it is, can't even tell. Looks like it might have been placed there, or I'm not even sure what that is, but you have to look more closely. Attention bottleneck. When multitasking, any attention you give to one task subtracts attention from another task. So hopefully this term will be somewhere in the textbook or in these slides. I haven't pre-looked at them, but there's a term called cognitive miser. Humans are cognitive misers, which basically means that our brain doesn't like to waste capacity on things it doesn't have to. It's why we use concepts rather than memorizing things verbatim. So we have a limited capacity. Our brains are information processors, but we don't have a cloud backup, and we have a very limited capacity. I mean, it's very impressive in a way, but we can't do everything all the time. So there are limits on memory, there's limits on attention, there's limits on every single thing. So there's always going to be kind of bottlenecks. We can only focus on any one thing at a time. Unfortunately, it doesn't show us what the Stroop effect is, but I'll explain it shortly. So the Stroop effect is a tendency to read a word instead of saying a color of the ink in which it's printed. So you might be given a list of words, right? And the words will be like red, blue, yellow, green, red, blue, yellow, green, but in random order. So the word will say red, but it might be in blue ink. And then it'll say green below that, but it'll be in yellow ink. And it'll say yellow below that, but it'll be in green ink, etc. It becomes very hard to read the text of the word because we see the color and our brain sort of trips up, kind of stumbles, right? So we can't do it as quickly because our brain is sort of paying attention to both things. Change blindness is failure to detect changes in part of a scene. If you show people two almost identical pictures, but just remove one thing, it's difficult for people to determine if the pictures are identical or not. When change happens slowly, hard for our brain to process that because there's too many things to pay attention to. When we talk about attention, it's worth talking about attention deficit disorder. A lot of times disorders, although I don't consider ADD and ADHD to be disorders, they're just different neurotypes personally. I think the DSM still could list them as disorders, but I would almost guarantee that in future editions that will be fixed. Because these are not, a disorder is like something is broken, right? Something went wrong, something bad happened to you, now your brain doesn't work right. ADHD is not like that. People with ADHD, it's not that their brains don't work right. There is no right per se. It's that their brains work differently, right? So most people are capable of modulating their attention to sort of narrow it in when they need to focus on one thing and making it bigger when they don't, and using executive functioning to switch back and forth between tasks and keeping track of things. People with ADHD have different patterns of attention, right? They don't have the normal patterns of attention the neurotypical person does. Maybe they hyper-focus on something for 8 hours. They don't even remember to eat or sleep or whatever it might be, and then they collapse for 8 hours after that, or 24 hours after that. They're often easily distracted. They're prone to impulsiveness and moodiness. They are often not able to follow through on plans because of executive functioning challenges. Right? But ADHD is great for creativity. It's also great for just sort of actors, artists. It's also great for, can be, now it provides, when it comes to human relationships, it can be a challenge to sort of follow through on plans, for example, or to pay attention to the little things, but also someone with ADHD can maybe be totally present in a relationship, in an activity, where someone who's neurotypical may not be totally present. They may be thinking about all the things they have to do, right? So these are just differences, and part of the challenges we live in an economic system that is, so especially with ADHD and ADD and autism, these different neurotypes, they become sort of disabilities within the lens of capitalism, because capitalism requires us to get up every day, be somewhere by 8 o'clock and do that thing. It's usually a very boring thing and it's often repetitive, and maybe it's loud, maybe there's a lot of people there, etc. So it's much easier to function under capitalism if you're neurotypical than if you have ADHD or autism. So these become disorders or more problems based because of the economic and social system we have rather than because of the disorders themselves. So I think people with ADHD often have trouble maintaining attention on tasks. They're not interesting or shifting attention from one task to another. I guess it's worth mentioning that ADHD has to do with abnormalities in dopamine or differences in dopamine. ADHD drugs typically raise the brain's natural level of dopamine. So dopamine makes us sort of pay attention to things like, ooh, shiny object over there. Let me check that out. Ooh, let me check this out. Oh, interesting person to maybe meet and have sex with. Let me go there. Oh, food over there. Let me go there. Dopamine is responsible for sort of motivated behavior, moving us towards things. So people with lower levels of dopamine are naturally going to sort of seek out activities that provide dopamine. So an ADHD medication just sort of raises the brain's natural level of dopamine and allows people to not be as sort of distracted. Choice delay task and stop signal task. Choice delay task, offering a choice between a small reward now and a bigger reward later. People with ADHD are more likely to choose the immediate reward, especially with longer delays. So this was famous. This is kind of famously done in the marshmallow experiment. Psychologists at Stanford University, they brought little kids in and said, here's a marshmallow, you can eat it now, but if you wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes until I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. And the videos are really funny. You watch little kids trying to squirm in their seat, waiting for that second marshmallow. And it turns out that this capacity is a very strong predictor of all kinds of success later in life, from doing well in school, having a successful career, successful marriage, all that stuff. The ability to delay rewards is incredibly powerful ability skill. And it turned out, so the original study didn't sort of catch this fact, but it turns out that these were not just natural genetic differences in children. It turns out that the kids that were doing better were from families of higher socioeconomic status. So there's something about those environments and the way those parents were teaching their children and the different activities they were exposed to, et cetera, that was building up these children's capacity. So this is not a static capacity. It's something that our childhood affects very much. It's also something we can get better at in practice. Stop signal task. A person responds as quickly as possible to a signal, but inhibits the response if a second signal appears quickly after it. Most people with ADHD will have trouble inhibiting their response after a short delay. So ADHD is an executive functioning deficit, essentially, or difference, you might say. And a lot of our executive functioning has to do with inhibition, with inhibiting responses. That's, in a lot of ways, what makes us human is our capacity to inhibit our responses, to respond to a situation where our first instinct is aggression, but to respond to it in a different way, amongst other things. Okay, categorizing. Categorizing causes our brains to require less time and energy to process our environment. That's why we use concepts. We have to categorize things. Otherwise, we cannot make sense of the world we live in. Ambiguous definitions make some concepts harder to categorize than others. A prototype is a familiar or typical example. Depending on how closely something matches, we call it a member of the category, non-member, or a borderline case. So how the heck do we understand the world around us? I'm looking at my computer. What else do I see? I see a bike outside the window. I see a lamp. I see a window. I see trees. I see grass. I see rocks, etc. What's going on there? So I'm using concepts to process this information. Sensory stimulation is coming in. Sensory stimuli is coming in. I'm using my set of concepts that I've learned in my 42 years of life on this planet thus far to process that information into various little groups, categories. And so how do we do that? How do we make these categories? How do we decide what something is? We see a gray blob on the ground. How do we decide it is a rock rather than a pile of dog poop or whatever? Okay, so a prototype is typically how we do that. So we could have definitions for things, right? Like a chair. A chair is something you sit on, but it's surprisingly hard to define a chair. And you can try this at home. I'll wait a few seconds. Think about a definition for a chair. What makes something a chair? Okay, give you 5 seconds. Now, think about all the possible exceptions to that chair, that example, right? So when I think about chair, I think 4 legs. Okay. Well, what if someone has a campfire pit and they have some logs sitting around the fireplace, just big chunks of log, are those chairs? Well, not clear. Maybe they're not, maybe they are, maybe they're not. Well, what if the logs have like a little bit of a back and then the front is cut off? So now you've got a round log with like a platform and then a back also. Okay, so now it doesn't have legs, but it has a flat part for sitting on and a back, so maybe that is a chair now. Definitions, logical definitions are very philosophers traffic in definitions. They spend a lot of time doing that, as do scientists, and it can take a long time to come up with a really good definition, and it can often be a debate whether something fits into a certain category. Okay, that is not good for day-to-day life. Day-to-day life, we need quick, easy, fast. So we use prototypes. So if I say, what is a fruit? Think of a fruit. You close your eyes, the first thing you're probably going to think of is an apple, probably a red apple, right? That's in America, that's kind of the most prototypical fruit. In India, it's probably going to be a banana, right? Because bananas are much more common. It's hot, it's tropical, most places. Bananas grow everywhere. Apples only grow in the north, typically. So we typically categorize things using prototypes. Now this has advantages. It also has some disadvantages because this is where things like racism and prejudices and biases come from. If I ask you to think about a doctor, close your eyes, think about a doctor. Now it's interesting. I'm getting kind of conflicting. I'm sort of getting like a double image. I sort of see like a white man, but I also see like a white woman. I've seen a lot of doctor shows. My daughter is really into Grey's Anatomy right now. There's a lot of women, so but a lot of times, when we think about things like CEO, doctor, president, because of our history here in America, we think of, a white man oftentimes, or many people do. So there's advantages and disadvantages to this prototype system our brains make use of. Conceptual networks and priming. Okay, when we think of something, we link it to more specific examples, more general categories, and related terms. So our brain is full of neurons. These neurons are connected to other neurons. So each neuron has about 10,000 connections. There's about 80 billion neurons. Woo, it's a lot of connections, a lot of information going around and around in our brain. Concepts are not stored in one particular neuron. What they are stored in is a network, a neural network, a pattern of connections, right? So everything about you that makes you you, your specific, unique beliefs and experiences and ways of processing information, all that is stored in the patterns of connections between your neurons. Okay, so these neural networks become activated when they are primed, right? Or when they experience something. So maybe I say the word home. Now the word home is stored in various neural networks, probably not just one. They're sort of chunks of that concept stored in different neural networks. And connected to that word home is a lot of different things. So for some people, connected to the word home might be, for me, I think of Florida because that's where I'm from. And when I think about like a childhood home, it's Florida for me. For other people, it's Ohio. And, Florida looks different from Ohio, different kinds of trees, different kinds of weather, right? So for me, the concept of like hot weather, hot, humid weather is associated with home more so than cold weather. Swamps are associated with home more so than mountains. For some people, the concept of home is connected to concepts of abuse and violence or sexual abuse or drug use, being unsafe, feeling unhappy. Other people, their concept of home is connected to lots of warm, loving, positive things. Congratulations if that's you. You have, won one of life's lotteries. So great job on that one. Anyway, so we get this concept of home activated, and it's going to now start to spread to other things, concepts of parents, mother, abuse, love, connection, weather, all different kinds of things, right? And sometimes, you find yourself like thinking about something really weird and you're like, how would I start thinking about that? And sometimes you can actually remember kind of the chain of thinking that led you to start thinking about that. So priming is something psychologists do, which is basically give people some kind of information to sort of get the ball rolling in a particular direction in terms of the neural networks. And a lot of times if we're trying to heal, say from a trauma or change our behaviors, what we have to do is, certain neural networks can become chronically activated. If we think about something all the time, those neural networks become chronically activated. Now, if we're trying to become a professional basketball player, we want our neural networks for basketball to be front and center pretty much all the time. We want to be visualizing, all the different types of plays we can do and all the different defensive schemes and all that stuff. So chronic activation. Chronic activation can be a good thing, can be a great thing. We can make use of it, but it can also be a really challenging thing when we have certain neural networks that we don't want to be active, to be chronically activated. Maybe we're addicted. So we're addicted to porn, we're addicted to a certain drug, addicted to certain video games. Everything is reminding us of this bad thing. And now we have to figure out how to sort of avoid doing that thing long enough so that those chronically activated neural networks sort of sink down further and further. They're not right at the sort of tip of our tongue, so to speak, in our brain. Okay, 8.2, solving problems, making decisions, type 1 processing, type 2 processing. This is important stuff here. Type 1, so this is a really key concept that unlocks a lot of different kind of doors to understanding various aspects of human behavior. Type 1 processing is used for tasks that are easy or appear to be easy, things that we do automatically, quickly. Heuristics are strategies for simplifying a problem and generating a satisfying guess or satisfactory guess. We do most of our thinking using this type 1 processing, right? So say, you're watching television and you hear Donald Trump say something about, climate change not being a big deal. Your family is Republicans, you're from Ohio, you like Trump, etc. Maybe you voted for him. He's part of your group. He's part of your in-group. He says something, you automatically trust him, right? That's a big kind of way that our brain works, is if we trust someone, we're not generally going to question the information that comes from them. So that's a kind of decision-making strategy that work pretty well in many different circumstances. Doesn't require any effort. It's instantaneous. Type 2 processing is used for anything that requires attention and effort, certainly math calculations, but many other things. An algorithm is an explicit procedure for calculating an answer or testing every hypothesis. So say you hear Donald Trump say something about climate change. Now you want to do some type 2 processing. Now you start to do research. You start to think about it. Does this make sense? Well, why is it like this? Why is it like that? Let me Google this. Let me Google that. Who else is saying this? Who's saying that, right? So that's going to be your type 2 processing. Now, it's not that type 2 processing is free from biases. Unfortunately, there's no way to be free from biases in our cognition, sadly. A really interesting study where they asked people, do you believe climate change is caused by humans or do you believe it's, caused by non-human factors? And they gave people a bunch of information, and the people read the information, and the people that originally said they believed that climate change was caused by non-human factors, they did not change their opinion. In fact, they held their opinion more strongly. The people who said that climate change is caused by human factors, after doing the research, they also came to the conclusion that they held originally. So, the do your research thing, somebody might say on social media, do your research. Everyone does research. Some people don't do very much, but everyone does some sort of research, you might say, or quasi-research. But we typically come to very different decisions, different conclusions, based on a wide variety of non-rational biases that we all hold. If you're interested in this topic, a fantastic book on cognitive psychology in general is called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's the only psychologist to win a Nobel Prize. Okay. Something is wrong with these slides. There's text back here, but we can't see them. That's okay. Something that happens when we are trying to make a decision is we often have to decide between two different strategies. One is a maximizing strategy. One is a satisficing strategy. Maximizing is, we want to invest some money. How can I invest this money to get the maximum return? Satisficing is, well, I just want to make sure my money grows at 10% a year. That is satisfactory. I don't need the maximum. So if you're just trying to satisfice, you can put your money in a general sort of exchange trade fund, an ETF, and, your money will grow in value by, roughly 10% a year, a little bit less than that probably, but Whereas maximizing, you have to do a lot of research trying to find, the best possible investment. Maximizers tend to make better choices, although they have more difficulty making those choices, not surprising. When facing too many choices, people sometimes give up and choose nothing. So this judgment and decision-making topic area, there's a number of different heuristics that have been outlined by cognitive psychologists. These are different ways that people tend to make decisions. And these are not exactly rational, but they're sort of little kind of shortcuts that people take that often work out okay and help us get through life. And most people are able to get through life reasonably well using these decisions most of the time. A representative heuristic is assuming an item that resembles members of a category is probably also in that category. This kind of heuristic thinking is often helpful and correct, but not necessarily when dealing with uncommon categories. So say you meet an Indian person, and you're like, oh, Indian food is spicy. This person must like spicy food, but maybe they hate spicy food. Base rate information, data about how common some category is. People tend to overlook the base rate information when making assumptions. So say you see a cat in the woods and it's big, but you don't get a good look at it. And you're like, well, I think that was a bobcat. Now, the reality is most likely it was a house cat because there's a lot more house cats than there are bobcats, right? So, but people tend to sort of overlook the fact that there's not many bobcats and lots of house cats in Ohio. Availability heuristic assumes that if we can easily think of examples of a category, then that category must be common, right? So, basketball player and black and being good at basketball, right? We can easily think of a lot of black people that are really good at basketball. Michael Jordan and LeBron James, all black people must be good at basketball. Or you can easily think of, a white president or white CEO. And then you might think, okay, well, this person is a good manager of things or whatever. If you think, get classic examples, you're getting on a plane, you're scared that the plane might crash, right? Now, it's not very common that planes crash, but we can very easily imagine and we can think of examples of plane crashes. So it makes us more fearful than we should be. Uncommon events are highly memorable, distort our assumptions, which can cause us to overestimate or underestimate the probability of an event. Representative heuristic and availability heuristic, a little chart. Representative heuristic, it's a tendency to assume that an item resembles members of a category, probably belongs to that category, but it leads us astray. When something resembles members of a rare category, availability heuristic is a tendency to assume that the more easily we can think of members of a category, the more common that category is. But one category gets more publicity than the other, or is more memorable, which can lead us astray. Overconfidence. Critical thinking is careful evaluation of evidence for and against any conclusion. People tend to overestimate the knowledge required for any task, especially after watching someone else do it. Striving for something just out of reach. Examples could include a new job, a promotion, or winning an election. Can be harmful by causing people to make hasty and costly mistakes. Examples could include investors losing money or failing a test by not studying enough. Additional cognitive errors. I'm going to start at the bottom and make my way up to confirmation bias. Well, I'm going to start at the top. Confirmation bias. This one's really important. If you only remember one thing from this lecture, remember confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is seeking evidence to support a favored hypothesis instead of considering other possibilities. So then this speaks to perception, right? So this is related to perception. We tend to perceive the things that support what we already believe, right? So if we believe that people are selfish assholes or people are angry and mean, what we're going to do, our brain is always looking to confirm our baseline hypotheses. So our brain is going to look for evidence that that's true. And every time we see someone being mean, we're going to go, there it is. People are mean and nasty. But we're going to conveniently ignore all the times we see people being kind and generous. If we think that we're a piece of shit and we can never do anything right, we're going to remember all the times we failed at something and forget all the times we succeeded at something. Now, this cognitive bias, like everything else, has its roots in evolution. Much more dangerous to think you're right or to have a hypothesis, test it, and then be wrong about it than it is to be right about it. So that's a little abstract. What does that mean? Say you're walking along the woods. You have a hypothesis. There's a saber-toothed tiger in the and behind that rock over there. So now you start being careful, you get out your spear, you're trying to defend yourself, you start making noise. Or let's say this, hear a noise, your hypothesis is it's a saber-toothed tiger. We're going to start, our brain is automatically going to sort of be shifted over to the yes version of that. Because say we think it's a saber-toothed tiger and it turns out it was just the wind rustling the leaves. Really no harm done other than some moments of stress and anxiety. If we have an hypothesis, maybe it's a saber-toothed tiger, but we're like, no, it's not. It was just the wind. We keep walking without being careful, and there actually is a tiger. It jumps out and eats us. Okay, so that's bad. So our brain really does seek to confirm. And this is like, political beliefs, religious beliefs, evidence to the existence of God. If you're a Republican, it's, Republicans are good and Democrats are bad. You're going to seek information that promotes that idea. If you're a Democrat, it's going to be Democrats are good, Republicans are bad. And you're going to seek out that information that confirms those hypotheses. So confirmation bias really does have this incredibly profound effect on our interpersonal relationships, on our political and religious beliefs, on our day-to-day life in so many different ways. Okay, functional fixedness adheres to a single approach or a single way of doing things. It's kind of like sometimes it's like these critical thinking things. A famous one is like an egg, stand an egg up on its end, and people try and they try and balance it, but it always falls over. And the solution to the problem is you sort of crack the egg so that you flatten the bottom and you just stand it up, and it works just fine. Framing effect is answering a question when it is worded differently. So if you have ground beef and you say 90% lean, people are like, ooh, great, 90% lean. I love that. Give me some of that. If you say 10% fat, people are like, that sounds kind of gross. I don't want that. And so people are much more likely to make one decision or the other just based on how it's worded. Sunk cost effect is the willingness to do something because money or effort has already been spent. This is often in gambling. You're playing poker and you bet a bunch of money, but you realize it was a mistake. The right thing to do is to fold that hand, but sometimes people will just keep putting money into the table. You're not a poker player like most people, but you do have relationships like most people. So say you've been in a relationship for a while and it's not working out, it's making you unhappy, but you're like, you know what, I've already put all this time and energy into it. Let me just keep going. You can't get that money back. You can't get that time back. We always need to sort of make decisions based on what is best for us going forward. Conspiracy thinking. People who believe in a conspiracy theory tend to believe in more than one conspiracy, tend to be less educated, have high levels of anxiety, low self-esteem, and be gullible, do not feel in control or believe their values are being attacked, which causes beliefs to arise. I don't love this slide. I think conspiracy thinking is a term that can be used, to smear people with ideas that are different from the mainstream. So a lot of things that were sort of conspiracies maybe at one time are not conspiracies at the other time. That being said, people do believe fantastical things, and we should try and understand it and why that happens. Essentially, our brain we have to have a coherent picture of the world. We have to. As humans, that's just a fundamental need. We have to feel that we have some sense of the way the world is working. Now, when we have less education, for example, when we grew up in poverty and maybe we're still in poverty, we're just sort of less, you find this a lot in religious communities, unfortunately, and I don't mean to disparage any communities, but these communities tend to be less interested in facts, for example, or the world as such and trying to understand it on its own terms, and more interested in trying to fit information from the world into a particular ideology. When people don't really understand the world as well as they could, they're going to fill in the gaps by making connections that don't exist, right? And that's essentially what a conspiracy theory is. But again, I don't love that term and the way it's sometimes used. Okay, expertise. Expertise enables people to solve problems quickly with minimum error. People who start off doing well at something are more likely to become interested and devote their time to it. Good and quick feedback and practice are essential to improvement. Experts can look at a pattern and recognize its important features very quickly. They've learned to recognize common patterns in their area of expertise. So basically, expertise is our brain just getting really good at processing certain kinds of information, whether that's really good at drawing or really good at, looking at a particular piece of land, and maybe you're a landscaper and you just visualize instantly what would look good here and there. It's because you've built up many years of experience and that you've seen similar situations. So your brain is automatically sort of just doing what it needs to do very quickly and very effectively. Near and so it's basically about the transfer of skills from one area to another. Transfer is a benefit from a skill from practicing a similar skill. Far transfer is a benefit from skill to practicing something unrelated. So if you're practicing, say, one basketball move, it might help you with a similar basketball move, but then you might also get better at playing basketball by practicing holding your breath underwater to sort of learn how to calm down your nervous system under a stressful situation. Okay, language. We have a whole nother can of worms here. Different topic, important topic. There's some really fantastic videos of parrots talking and also of Bunny the dog who learned to talk using buttons. So some very interesting stuff that gives some insights. There's also a video of Pogo the gorilla using sign language. So pretty fascinating stuff in my opinion. Language. Productivity is the ability to combine words into new sentences. Typically, we say that an organism has language when there are an infinite number of things that can be said, right? So animals communicate, many different animals communicate, but if they don't have what's called infinite generativity, if they can't say an infinite number of different things, then we wouldn't necessarily call that language, although it's still communication. Transformational grammar is converting a deep structure into a surface structure. So deep structure is the idea that there's a kind of universal language grammar that we're all born with as humans. And transformational grammar is turning that into kind of a more superficial language system or a particular language system. The deep structure in transformational grammar is the underlying meaning of a sentence. This is explored in logic. Philosophers have done that. The surface, computer programmers also do that. Surface structure is a sequence of words that construct a sentence. Non-human precursors to language. Several species of animals have been studied to examine their ability to learn and utilize language. Chimpanzees responded to basic verbal and physical communication. Most impressive results came from bonobos. Several of them learned how to press keys on a keyboard to create short sentences. This is, I think, an area that's rapidly evolving. I've seen news stories recently about how with AI, they were able to decode some whale communications, and people are realizing they're more sophisticated than we knew previously, that they use, I think they found this out in whales and elephants recently. They have specific names for each other. There was evidence of crows counting recently. I mentioned Bunny the dog, who can make short sentences with words. So we're starting to see more and more of this, and I think we will probably find that there are many animals with this capacity, but we just haven't sort of given them the tools to communicate to us. But when we look at what actually animals do, it's very complex. So it's not surprising that they can think similarly to young human children. Intelligence without language or language without aspects of intelligence is possible. Williams syndrome is a genetic condition characterized by mental retardation in most regards, but good use of language relative to other abilities. Language acquisition device is a built-in mechanism for acquiring language. Language, it's just a theoretical thing. Basically, it's an idea that we have this set of neurons and set of brain structures that allow us to do this, and together we call it the language acquiring device. Deaf children who are not taught a sign language invent one of their own as a means of communication. There's interesting research on children who have experienced extreme deprivation. There was an interesting case study of a couple of girls who were found in India in the early 1900s. It's well documented. They were actually raised by wolves, and there's stories of Romulus and Remus supposedly were the founders of Rome, who were raised by wolves. So there's different interesting stories, but this one was actually well documented. And basically, the girls ran around on all fours like wolves and wanted to eat raw meat like wolves and such. They did not had body language and vocalization like wolves. They did not really, one of them died pretty early on, the one that survived. She did not really ever acquire language. It doesn't mean that she was mentally retarded or something like that. It just means that she wasn't socialized in a way that she was able to learn language. Language in the human brain. Humans' ability to learn language came from evolutionary adaptations such as increased breath control and a disposition to imitate, the ability to learn and remember vocal patterns, and enhanced areas of the brain that control the larynx. There's a couple different areas in the brain that if we have damage to, it will very significantly affect our capacity for language. One is the Broca's area and one is the Wernicke's area. Broca's aphasia is caused by damage to the frontal cortex in a particular spot. I forget which side. It's either on this side, I think it's on the left side. Yeah, that would make sense because it's the language side. And it's somewhere right about here. Both areas, the Broca's and the Wernicke's. And the Broca's aphasia results in challenges in speaking, producing language. And the Wernicke's aphasia results in damage and decreased capacity for apprehension, despite being able to speak. Stages of language development: 3 months, random vocalization; 6 months, more distinct babbling; 1 year, babbling that resembles typical sounds of the family's language; 1.5 years, some words. These are averages again. 2 years, 2-word phrases; 2.5 years, longer phrases; 3 years, vocabulary near 1,000 words; 4 years, close to adult speech competence. There are also very big differences in terms of socioeconomic status. You see some 4-year-old children with vocabulary from tier families with vocabularies significantly higher or drastically higher than adults who are from lower socioeconomic status backgrounds. A child who is never exposed to language during early development is permanently impaired at learning one. We talked about that. Bilingualism is the ability to use 2 languages. People who learn 2 languages from infancy show activity on both sides of the brain when speaking both languages. People who learn 2 languages after the age of 6 just use one hemisphere while speaking both languages. That is pretty interesting. Probably indicates that everyone should learn multiple languages before the age of 6. And there does seem to be some cognitive benefits to knowing multiple languages, although it's unclear whether it's specifically from knowing the multiple languages or some other factor related to being bilingual. Understanding language. To understand a word, you have to imagine the experience to which it refers. We understand ambiguous words and sentences in context by applying the knowledge we have about the world in general. Embedded clauses and negatives. Many sentences are difficult to understand, especially those with embedded clauses or one or more negatives. Embedded clauses overburden our memories by muddling the meaning of our sentence. Adding a negative to a sentence can unintentionally give a sentence a more negative connotation, and double negatives can distort the intention of the sentence. I'm not sure that's super relevant, but those are true things. Reading and word recognition. A phoneme is a unit of sound. A morpheme is a unit of meaning that helps break down the meaning of individual words. Years of reading makes you an expert in recognizing letters and common words instantaneously. The word superiority effect is identifying a letter more accurately when it's part of a word than when presented by itself, right? So we're better able to identify the parts when they're part of a whole. Okay, so we know, even though this part is covered up in both places, we know that this is an R and this is a P. And that we know this is an F, not an E, because of the context, etc. Okay, reading and eye movements. When reading, you alternate between fixations and saccades. Fixations are when your eyes are stationary. Saccades are quick eye movements from one fixation point to another. Fixations are longer on uncommon words and words with more than one meaning. So when we're reading, we're trying to comprehend the meaning of an individual word, but we also need the context. So we're kind of like sort of scanning ahead and back. We're moving back and forth, but we're also sort of focusing on important points in this various sentences we're reading. Fascinating, I know. Okay, we come to our lovely summary. Now that the lesson has ended, you should have learned how to distinguish between attentive and pre-attentive processes. Give examples of phenomena related to attention, such as change, blindness. Discuss what is known about attention deficit disorder. Discuss how categorization affects thinking. Distinguish between type 1 and type 2 processing. Explain the advantages and disadvantages of maximizing and satisficing. List common errors of thinking. Discuss factors that lead to belief in conspiracy theories. Discuss the basis for developing expertise and what experts do that makes them experts. Discuss attempts to teach language to chimpanzees. Evaluate explanations for how humans are specialized to learn languages. Distinguish between types of language and impairment after brain damage. describe how children develop language, and explain the role of eye movements in reading. Okay, I just finished up my second recording, so I'm tired now. Anyhow, if you have any questions, you know what to do. Hit me up one way or another, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.